What do you think is the most important message to come out of this film?
I think one of the interesting things that goes on in the film is you see that reporters are working very hard and doing lots of good things, but you never see the role of editors. And I think in a web age, I think that part of the value that an organization like the New York Times brings is the additional layer of thinking and consideration that comes off of editors. As a reporter, you know, I have a lot of good ideas. I never know which ones are good. And I think that you see in the paper the women and men who work there helping to make as good a paper, as good a website as they can every single day. And that large heaving organism is part of what's important. A newspaper, a big website, emerges from the spaces between people. It's not just any individual person, and sort of that it's the product of a discussion and thought.
What's it like to work there now after, in the aftermath of this film and the economy in the United States being in the shambles?
Well, I'm just like you. I'm happy to have a job, number one. I think working in journalism beats having a real job. I think that's a value. I think it makes you sort of more excited to go to work every day. In the film, things are pretty grim, and so we're all very, very worried. We've got an improved capital structure now. We've got a metered model where we're getting consumers to pay. Things are working better, but it's a daily fight. We just announced additional buyouts, small, like 20, 30 people. But as you mentioned, the U.S. economy is in shambles. We would be a lot more able to sort of make this pivot into new business models if the business in general wasn't so troubled, if real estate wasn't so troubled, if retail wasn't in such trouble. So it's a double whammy, what you would call secular change, which is how revenues are assigned, you know, some to the web, some to newspapers, some to television, and then cyclical, which is about where we're at in the economy. And the U.S. economy, along with the rest of much of the globe, just refuses to recover.
But does it affect the way you work or the way you produce journalism, trying to be sort of the beacon of journalism in the United States?
I don't think in terms of serving as any kind of beacon. I mean, when you work at the New York Times, my concern, it was my first daily that I ever worked at, was to not bring shame on the institution. I was worried about whether my work was good enough to be in the paper. You know, you make it as good as you can, as fast as you can. You file on many platforms. You make video. You do the website. You write the story. You Twitter out what you've done. You do a blog post about what you've done. Then you collapse, sleep for a while, and then you get up again and do it the next day.
That's your MO.
Well, that's everyone's MO. Is it isn't just quality, it's how much can you produce on how many different platforms.
Do you feel the standards of journalism have changed during the past few years?
Not really. I think the web is a great accountability mechanism for journalism and many other things, politics. On the web, you can know and check everything. All known thought is available to you in the, you know, by accessing the cloud, by accessing the web, and the web becomes a self-cleaning oven. So if you get something wrong, you're attacked, and people pull you up on it and pound on you until you correct it. I mean, the New York Times has always been very big on corrections. I live in fear of ending up on that page 3 with, you know, in a column by David Carr, we incorrectly, it used to keep me up nights, and sometimes it still does.
In the film, there are some interviews with other digital media editors that they're almost eager to see the New York Times go down in flames. And I was wondering, what's the reason for this sentiment?
I've always thought it was hilarious that many sort of web denizens, the leadership on the web, roots against the New York Times and other so-called legacy or mainstream media, because if you look into Twitter, once every 4 seconds there's a tweet containing New York Times information, and that's good news for us because what we thought of as perhaps an enemy of the New York Times may in fact be a way to access new audiences. But when people who make a living aggregating content on the web root for the demise of the New York Times, I think it's kind of like the pilot fish on the whale, where they're sort of sucking their lifeblood and their existence out of the whale, yet they root for the whale to die. And I always tell them, well, if we weren't around to do some reporting instead of just annotating and opinionizing about what we do, you might actually have to pick up the phone and make a few phone calls or come and do some interviews yourself.
You applied investigative reporting on your own life to write the memoir, The Night of the Gun. Now, how did this affect your role as a professional reporter? Was it difficult to balance those two roles?
You mean the fact that I was publicly known as a crackhead? Or didn't seem to make much difference. I was worried about that. I mean, when I gave the book, when the book was finished, I handed it to my bosses with kind of a pair of tongs and said, tell me what you think about it. And they really didn't seem too worried about it. I don't think it changed every once in a while if I write something about Fox they don't like, that they'll call me a crackhead, or when I did a story that's in the movie about the Tribune Company, the head of Tribune Company, published a link to my memoir and a reminder that I had had a life of, in which I had been arrested and been in trouble and beat people up. That's okay. That's part of who I am. I'm really not that guy anymore. Since then, I've raised children, ran newspapers, been a good, hardworking reporter, and I'm not going to deny who I am. And writing a book about it, one that was reported based on documents and interviews, was a way of sort of taking custody of that history.
So maybe it made you a better reporter?
Here's how it changed me. I did a lot of media after the book, and I noticed there were like two kinds of reporters. One would come in and sort of make a speech about what I had done and what my book meant and what it meant in the broader context of American literature or memoirs or junkie memoirs or whatever. And the other type of reporter would just come in and do what you're doing right now, which is ask simple and direct questions that aren't really full of opinions. And the better stories always came off of people who asked the simple and direct questions and didn't come in and make a big speech about what I had done. And the interesting thing about that is I was always the kind of reporter that would come in and tell you what you did and what it meant and make a big speech before I ever asked a single question. So I don't make so many speeches anymore as a reporter. I just dive right in and begin asking questions and assume nothing. And that's something I learned from being covered. I mean, some of the stories were great and some of them were really stupid. And you could kind of correlate to people's process. I mean, one of the skills of being a journalist is listening, and it was a real reminder to be a person who was covered that you have to listen as a reporter to really find out.
How do you see the New York Times like 10 years from now? How is it going to stay relevant and viable and hopefully financially sound?
I got to be honest, I'm not really that worried about it. I'm very encouraged by the fact that we have the metered model that we came up where, people can come and visit us for 20 times for free, and the 21st time we attempt to get them to sign up. 225,000 people have signed up to pay for the paper digitally. And yet our web traffic has gone up slightly. A lot of people thought it would go down. It seems like the consumers, a certain set of consumers, are willing to pay for the New York Times on the web. And historically, the newspaper business has always been advertising combined with consumer revenues. And when the web came along, we all decided there was something magical about it, that we could just make enough money on ads, and that didn't turn out to be true, and that led to some sort of scary times. But I do think that our organization and others are making adjustments which will lead to, long-term survival. It's a daily fight. It's a lot more complicated than it used to be when many newspapers had functional monopolies, and what they did, the monopolies are gone. They're operating in a more competitive environment. But I think the New York Times has the tools, both journalistically and business-wise, to survive.